Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about the importance of reading, writing, and running, and how those habits can be good in the service of my personal ultimate goal, but a goal that I also believe other people share. And that goal is the reduction of unnecessary suffering for the most amount of people. So why is reading important? Reading is useful because it's the acquisition of knowledge, which could be thought of as a form of indirect experience. Knowledge combined with experience, in my estimation, is a good definition of wisdom. And so, insofar as you can gain more knowledge, ideally you can accelerate your pathway towards the acquisition of wisdom or the development of wisdom. Reading is helpful because it can also bridge the different types of knowledge structures that we have. And here I'm pulling from a book called Searching for Memory by Daniel Schacter. And he talks about three types of memory systems that we have, but I think it's also useful to conceptualize them as three landscapes of knowledge that we as humans have. And so one landscape of memory is procedural or behavior, and this is like muscle memory. Most people are familiar with this type of knowledge or this type of memory. It's something that grounds out that we can't really put into words. If you were to ask yourself, how are you typing, or how are you speaking, or how are you driving, at some point you're conveying or explicating higher level abstract movements, but at some point when it gets down to the nitty gritty micro movements, you don't really know how you're doing that. And that's behavioral memory or behavioral knowledge. Then you have episodic or imagistic knowledge. And this is our capacity to have images in our mind. Typically, they're emotionally latent. And you could also think of it as the sequencing of events into a story about your life, particularly when talking about episodic memory. When you think back across your past and you sequence certain events, perhaps at smaller time scales or even at larger time scales as far as months or years, and you segment your life into epochs that tell the story of who you are, that's episodic or imagistic memory. And then we have the final landscape of knowledge, which is the semantic, and it's the most abstract, it's the most conceptual, it's the use of words and sometimes images to create propositions about how things are. It's our capacity to have factual knowledge, for lack of better terms. And all three of these types of knowledge, procedural, imagistic, and semantic, are in relation to one another in that the same information could be manifested or revealed in these different landscapes, and with these differences convey different meanings. And when I say different, I would say that they're deeper meanings. And this is part of the reason why we say that a person's actions speak louder than their words. When you watch what someone is doing or how they're behaving, you typically take that as truth, or you take that as more representative of their inner expressions, their inner emotions, and their inner thoughts rather than what they're saying. And so reading is helpful because, particularly if you're reading fiction, if you're reading stories, or even if you're reading nonfiction, autobiographies, or technical texts, what you're doing is you're embodying the authors, the characters, and you're reading the words, and so you're in the semantic landscape. But great works of literature, great writers have this capacity to compress and pack a lot of information into the words, and when you're reading them, they persuade you to embody what's going on in the text, and this unpacks all of that information that was in the words into the imagistic. And so the words can generate emotions in you and can generate images in your mind. And truly deep texts make you want to embody what's happening. And so you imagine yourself engaging in the dialogue that's occurring in the story. Or even if you're reading a technical book, you imagine yourself, I don't want to say writing the actual book, but you imagine the author of the text thinking through the different ideas and playing with them And it even helps if you have the contextual information as far as the culture that the author was in, or the time that they were writing, or what sequence is the specific book in terms of the history of this author's work. And so you can get a feel for what they're trying to convey and how they see the world. I think stories in particular are most useful in conveying information that is deep through all three layers of knowledge. And one example, I was recently reading the Gospel of Mark, and I'm about halfway through it. And there's this particular scene that struck me as I was reading it. And so Christ is with his disciples, and he's performing many miracles. He's resurrecting the dead. He's curing the sick. He's taking handfuls of bread and a handful of fish and is able to feed thousands of people. He's walking on water. He's performing all these miracles, but in this particular scene, he notices that his disciples still seem to be surprised or unconvinced that Christ is actually the Son of God. And so he calls them on it and, asks them, where have you guys been these past couple of days? Or have you not been watching me performing these miracles? Like, why do you still question me? And the motif that comes to my mind as I read this story is, well, first, let's lay out a few assertions. Let's say that God is ultimate truth. If God is ultimate truth and Christ is the embodiment of God, well, then Christ is the embodiment of the ultimate truth. And so what's happening in this scene in the story? Well, the disciples, humans, mankind, are facing the embodiment of the ultimate truth, and yet they are blinding themselves to it. They are deceiving themselves. They're still unconvinced. They're not able to accept the reality of this truth, even though it's obviously in front of them. And so the motif or the theme or the archetype of man unable to accept the truth is something that I believe is true today. It's going to be true in the future, and it's always been true. It might be a perennial aspect of human nature and perhaps of reality. When I think in my own life, if I were to try to ground this archetype into my current existence, I think about all the good habits that I know I should have and the bad habits that I know I should dispense with. And so I have this knowledge, I have this true knowledge. Given my goal to reduce the most amount of unnecessary suffering for the most amount of people, I have this knowledge of how I should act. And so I have this embodied truth, this embodied knowledge that I understand to some degree would lead to optimal outcomes if I could only act in this certain way. And yet I still fall short. I still sin. I miss the mark. I fail to adopt good habits. I continue to facilitate my bad ones. And so to me, I am just like the disciples. And as I'm reading this story, I try to imagine myself as Christ performing all of these miracles and baffled essentially by why my followers aren't still fully convinced. But I also imagine myself as the disciples, and I ask myself, well, has there ever been a time when I knew the truth, but I either couldn't accept it or chose not to accept it and chose to cling on to my old ways of being? And the answer is yes. There's definitely times where I've done that. I'm still doing that to this day, and given that I'll never be perfect, it's something that I'm always going to have to wrestle with. And so I'm interested to finish the rest of the gospel and see how that turns out. But to me, that's just a great example of reading through texts, reading through great stories, and pulling out motifs that are true across all times and true at many levels of analysis. And so people could argue that, well, that's such an obvious truth. That's something that people, if they did a little bit of reflection in themselves, would find to be true within themselves. And if they spent any time with other humans, it's also something that could be true. And I definitely concede that. I think what's helpful about stories is that much of our direct experience is unconscious, and it's fulfilling our intuitions, and it enables us to have these gut feelings about the decisions and judgments that we make, but it's difficult to concretize it into words, and that's not always necessary. But what I think great stories can do is help you understand your unconscious a little more and reflect on those direct experiences that you've had that maybe you couldn't put into words, and it can help bring that knowledge through the procedural, up through the imagistic, and into the semantics, so that way it can be packaged and perhaps used to communicate with other people. And that leads me to the next habit that I think is important when it comes to trying to reduce unnecessary suffering, and that's writing. I'm going to say writing, but really I'm also referring to speaking. So as you're reading, as you're going through life and you're experiencing the world and reality and being, you're going to obtain a lot of information and a lot of knowledge. And if you want to help other people, or even if you want to help yourself, it's important to be able to synthesize that information and articulate it in a manner that's simple enough for other people to understand, but without lacking the depth and complexity that made it significant in the first place. And so I believe that writing and speaking practices are, I believe that writing and speaking helps you practice honing your thoughts and clearing them up and sequencing them in a manner that helps other people obtain the information without having to directly experience it themselves. And this could be in the form of writing a great story. It could be in the form of journaling. It could be in the form of what I'm doing now. A large part of why I'm trying to make these YouTube videos is so that I can become a better communicator. And I get to practice speaking and staring at this laptop as I stumble over my words and deciding whether or not I should edit these things out. But I like to believe that unconsciously I'm also becoming better at communicating and amalgamating the knowledge and experiences that I've had, so that way I can package it and communicate it in a manner that's helpful to other people. So reading is helpful to expand yourself and make you deeper and broaden your knowledge, and it enables you to understand the meaning of other people's experiences and then juxtapose those with your own, hopefully in a manner that pushes you towards the direction of more optimal behavior. And then writing and speaking helps you communicate what you've learned to other people, or even to your future self, or even to yourself in the present as you journal and write out and concretize your thoughts into words and then read them back and asking yourself the question, oh, is that right? Is that true? Is that how I actually feel? So that's how writing can be important. The last activity I want to talk about is running. So the first two, reading and writing, had the thread of obtaining information and then articulating it and conveying it to other people to convince them of a better way of being and acting. I'll say that running is on a different thread, but here's how I tie it back to the ultimate goal. So as I said, my ultimate goal is to reduce the most amount of unnecessary suffering for the most amount of people. And part of that would be maintaining my mental and physical health. I imagine a scenario in the future where if my health were to decline because I failed to do what I was supposed to do today, well, I'm blessed enough to have people that love me, that are around me, and I know that they will want to sacrifice their time, their money, their effort to take care of me. And if not them, then perhaps the taxpayers or some other people that I am now a burden on because of something that I could, to a large degree, control. And so I just ask myself the question, is that something that I want to put them through? And the answer is no. And so to the degree that I can control the outcomes of my life, or specifically my health outcomes, I make it a point to have a habit of working out multiple times a week. And for me, I specifically enjoy running, although I also do strength training. And so I would advise that everyone have a protocol that incorporates both aerobic and anaerobic fitness. But for me, running is the manifestation of trying to reduce suffering that is unnecessary in the future. If I can continue to keep my heart healthy, to keep my body healthy, to enjoy the cathartic mental and psychological effects of clearing my mind or focusing in on something that's difficult, such as, getting up in the morning when I don't want to run, but going ahead and going out there and doing it and knocking out 10 miles or so, then that's something that I'm going to do. Running, as well as the other habits of reading and writing, also have something in common that I also read from the Gospel of Mark. And in a different scene in the text, Christ says that the Son of Man is meant to suffer, and he's going to be disliked or hated by the elders and the priests and the Pharisees and the scribes. And one of the ways I interpret that is to mean that life is suffering, but life is not only is life suffering, but we have the capacity to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary suffering. And there's necessary suffering that's involved with analyzing the traditions of society, analyzing our habits that we've built up over periods of time, discarding or sacrificing those traditions and rituals or ideas or bad habits that are not optimal, and replacing them with something that's better given our current conditions. And that's difficult. I think that to have a habit of reading and writing and running every day is to sacrifice your time, your energy, your body for the future. And it's something that's done on faith, because it's given that the future is qualitatively different from the past, it's not obvious that what worked in the past will work in the future, but it's the best that we have. And so, in closing, I'll just say, maybe part of what Christ is trying to say in the Gospel of Mark is that to ameliorate unnecessary suffering requires necessary suffering. And part of realizing what is necessary for us to endure and suffer through is the opening up of ourselves to the embodied truth. It's the things that you know you should do and the things that you know that you should stop doing. While we might not be able to engage fully with or wrestle with the ultimate truth, we have knowledge of where we are inadequate, and so that's a great place to start. I would encourage everyone to read, to write, and to run. But at a more macro level, I would encourage everyone to sit with those thoughts and that knowledge that you have, that embodied truth of when you ask yourself, where am I lacking? What should I strive towards? What should I stop doing? And bring those thoughts to your mind and make a plan to make things better in the future. Thanks everyone for your time and attention. See you in the next video.